My name is Tony Gosling. I'm a former BBC journalist in London and various regions of the UK. And my experience in mainstream broadcasting was very negative, I would say, because I found that, for example, working in Salisbury, as I did for the BBC for a year, that there was no ability to question and to investigate. And I thought that that was what the press was supposed to do. No, there was just press releases to copy and official people with an official view to tell the public. And there was really no questioning, very little. This was 1992, and the BBC was really being closed down. What's that? Thanks. Okay, so I just want to thank two people particularly today. One is Rob, who will be giving a presentation afterwards. Rob? It's just here. And also a chap called Charlie Holmes. Charlie was the guy who suggested to me that we should do some presentation in Oosterbeek in Arnhem around this subject back a long time ago. But there were two people I met from the original battle that also prompted me to get writing about this story. One was Tony Hibbert, Major Tony Hibbert. He was the brigade major at the bridge in Arnhem, who I met before he died 3 or 4 years ago and interviewed him. A fascinating guy, a really lovely guy, and his message was very clear, and it was about General Shoshabalski. That this guy was made a scapegoat and the British Army must apologise and must restore all of the honours to the guy. Secondly, Moffat Burris, he was in the 82nd Airborne Division. He was one of the people that took the bridge in Nijmegen, and he was absolutely livid that the British tanks didn't carry on. So, my work after the BBC, I worked for various NGOs and things like that, environment, and also Russia Today, who eventually dropped me, like the BBC had done, and also more recently I've been working for Press TV, which is the Iranian broadcasting, national state broadcaster in English, and they've also dropped me now. So this has become a bit of a pattern, I'm afraid. I'm quite happy to work for these people, but eventually they often decide they've had enough of me. So I'm not quite sure why that is. But anyway, so my website is nowadays I have various websites, but the program I do in Bristol every week is a 2-hour program where we look at local politics and national and international affairs. So I think for me it was an attempt to get me out of journalism. I just decided I'm going to carry on as a journalist because I enjoy it, and also because I think there's a lot of really good work to do as journalists now. Okay, part of this talk is about myths of Market Garden. Here it is, Market Garden. Right. But the first myth is that you can't uncover the lies. One of the things they say to you is that, people will never know. Actually, that's a lie. If you dig hard enough and if you speak to the right people who have the direct knowledge of something, you will know. And you can find out the truth, and I'll be talking about that later as part of this presentation. Also, this whole thing of exploding the myths, because the myths become bigger than the reality. The myths are all to do with, for example, liberation, as we're seeing all around the city, in Arnhem, Nijmegen, around this whole area, this whole thing about liberation. Of course, the battle was not actually a liberation. It was a failure. And it meant a particularly bad situation for the local residents, although they've been very generous in being friendly to the British, who made their lives so difficult by making such a mess of things. Also, the other myth is that this was just another battle. It wasn't just another battle. It was an incredibly important battle at a very important stage during World War II. And that's why I think there's this continuing interest in it, because there have been attempts to massage history of this battle. the twisting of history is quite Orwellian. So, let's start with the presentation. So I've got a little thing here, hopefully. So I'm going to basically run through these questions. But we'll start with my introductions. This is the basics of the battle. So here we go, we're going to make it to Arnhem, if we possibly can. And this is key, this little thing about the route, because if they'd succeeded in taking Arnhem, this would have been absolute chaos to the Nazi supply lines round this area. And they would have had to bring loads of other divisions from other parts, maybe from the Eastern Front as well, to stop this behind their lines. It would have been a very chaotic situation if they managed to make it to Arnhem, which they very nearly did. This was my introduction when I was age 15 to the battle, which was playing this game for 2 months every Saturday afternoon. 4 of us, young 15-year-olds from school, grammar school in South London. This is what we did as kids. We had to fight this battle. I was the British, my friend was the Nazis, and I lost. But that was my introduction. I didn't think much more of it after playing that battle. Now that's another picture of the same game. It's an American game. It's slightly biased because it makes it difficult for you not to do what the Allies did, like drop too far away from Arnhem. And it's quite a big game too, as you can see. It stretches right out. And we stuck it with blue tack to the wall. We were playing it on the wall over several weeks, and I was never quite sure if my friend, whose bedroom it was in, was moving some of the counters during the week. And we came back next Saturday, I thought, did I really leave that there? But anyways, let's get into the questions, because journalism should be about asking questions. Nowadays, there's very little questioning, I think, in the journalism I see. These 2 handsome guys were both dead by the end of the war. I think von Rundstedt was. Model shot himself, but these were the guys that knew how much the Germans knew. Model was in the Tafelberg, and von Rundstedt was in charge of this part of the Western Front. This is another aspect to all of this, is that who were the Nazis? Who were these guys? Here is Adolf Hitler's niece, Jenny Raubel, when she was 17. And he was 36. Now, apparently they were having a love affair. Now, I don't think we have the evidence directly to say that they were, but when a year after this was taken, this was in 1930 this was taken, and a year after, in 1931, she committed suicide. She tried to leave Hitler, and she'd had enough of him. But there's a lot of evidence that he shot her dead. She apparently killed herself with a pistol. Now, it was the cover-up of this murder that knitted together some of the key people in the Nazi regime. We're talking about Nazi Müller. I think his name was Rudolf Müller as well. He was the head of the Gestapo. And other people, Martin Bormann, who was involved in this cover-up, became the core of the Nazi regime. The people who helped cover up Hitler's murder of Jelly, his niece. This is another, aspect to all of this. I found this in one of those commando books, I think they call them, that you get as we used to get as children in our teenage years. I love these books. We used to enjoy reading them as teenagers, and in primary school. Look, sir, over by the woods, holy mackerel, tanks and Huns by the score. We've walked smack into a trap. So this was the Arnhem story. And these were the guys that were preparing the defence of this area. And this was their opposition. So the question is, how much did they know? Well, there's all sorts of evidence about that. But one of the most recent, I will share with you now. So maybe we should talk about the 2 main reasons they knew. One is King Kong. I'm not sure how, if we're going to have him first. Maybe it should be in a minute. One of the main reasons that these guys knew has been revealed recently through Ultra. Now, people know about Bletchley Park and the Ultra decryption service. That was how they did it. Simple as that. 2 weeks before the battle, it's now known that the British were reading the German radio traffic, and they knew. The Germans were discussing, they're coming, on their own radios. So I think I've got a transcript of that I can read out for you. With a bit of luck. Which they couldn't find at the time, actually. And it took them just until the day before to... I must find this, because I only found this about a week ago. This is what I mean about this battle, is it keeps surprising you. The more you look into it, the more evidence you find. Damn, it's supposed to be there. Just want to read out the exact transcript, which is what these guys knew from Ultra. Okay, here we go. Friday, the 15th of September. This was in the hands of the planners of Market Garden, a place called Moor Park in northwest London. And the actual message had been deciphered on the 9th of September. Allies in German reports, that's what they called it, because they had a whole section. Every time the Allies were mentioned, the people at Bletchley Park would put those decryptions into a certain section. Addressed to unspecified on the evening of Thursday, 9th of September. 30 British Corps, that's the 2nd British Army, between Antwerp and Hassel, bringing up further corps possible. So this is the Germans talking about what the British are up to, and the British listening in. 11 to 14 divisions with 800 to 900 tanks, photo reconnaissance tasks, indicate probable intention is to thrust mainly from the Wilhelmina Canal on both sides, Eindhoven into Arnhem. Further specification of area incomplete, but this is in brackets, sorry. So I'll just leave that bit out. To cut off and surround German forces Western Netherlands. Now, so that was known by the British on the 9th of September. The Germans knew quite a great deal about what was going on. And why it's very unlikely that it was a coincidence that they had the resting 2nd SS Panzer Corps just outside Arnhem, in the woods, with a little bit of grass coming from their mouth. Relaxing. So these guys knew a lot more than most of the historians will admit to. And these guys had let the cat out of the bag. Okay, so this is question number 2. Who gave permission for a former SS officer to help plan Market Garden? And of course, I'm sure you all know who that is here on the right. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, making it very clear to history that he was looking over the shoulders of Montgomery and Horrocks. So Montgomery was the overall commander. Horrocks was 30 Corps General. And by the way, he was very sick apparently during the battle. Now I wonder whether he was sick in the head or sick in the body, because he knew that he wasn't actually doing his job. And I will say one thing now about Horrocks, is that I was told by one of the publishers, he said, Horrocks, he left this letter to be opened after he died, about the battle. And he left it with a military publisher called Leo Cooper, who's the husband of Jilly Cooper, the famous novelist. Now, when Horrocks died, various people went to Leo and said, where's the letter from Horrocks? We want to know what really happened at Market Garden. And Leo Cooper was a very disorganised publisher. He had piles of paper everywhere. And he says, I think it's in this pile. No, he'd lost it, basically. Lost the letter. So it would be very interesting to read that. But it was significant that Horrocks here felt it was necessary to leave something to explain what had happened after he died. He didn't want to face up to it, face the cameras or whatever, while he was still alive. So anyway, why is this man here? Good question, eh? Yeah. Now, we're going to run through a lot of history very quickly now. Did anyone recognise this chap? Oliver Cromwell. Right, so we're going back a long way into history. Now, Cromwell's involvement with the English Civil War has meant a big legacy of bad things for Britain. first of all, his murder of the king was one of the first big conspiracies of history that is really well known about and documented, because he knew that if he didn't succeed in judicially murdering the king, then he would have his head chopped off. So he had to get it right, okay? Because he had the king in captivity, but he needed to have a trial, and he needed the king to be executed. So he wasn't going to mess around. So he was doing deals as well, apparently. I mean, I only just came across this as well. He was doing deals with, being a reprint of pamphlets published between this guy to promote the readmission of the Jews to England. So this was one of the results of the Civil War, the readmission of Jews to England. Now, that was a good thing. But was there a quid pro quo? Was somebody paying Cromwell to help Jews to come back into Britain? And here's a Masonic celebration thing of Cromwell. Now, it's quite clear that he was involved in this secret society of some sort in order to do this, right? The documentation is in this French pamphlet, which Alex, I don't know if Alex is here yet, but he helped translate some of this recently. I only came across this at Christmas time. This describes how the first secret Masonic lodges were used to set up a conspiracy to kill the king. What they'd done is they got people from all different aspects of the British Parliament and got them all on board with the execution of the king before they even embarked on the whole project. So at the same time in the Civil War, people might say, well, this is a long time ago, we had some fantastic things going on in Britain too. Here are the diggers, who were basically a sort of hippie movement, who was saying, actually, the land has been privatised, enclosed, we need to take the land back, the people need to take the land back. And that's what the Civil War, for them, was all about. We're having the land. If you're going to have a revolution, give us the land. And if you don't give us the land, we're going to take it. And so this guy, Gerard Winstanley, he was a weaver of some sort. So we're weavers straight on. And he decided to dedicate himself to this cause, to bring a good result from the Civil War. So the people can have the land back. Because they were suffering enclosures of the land, people were being turfed off the land, and the Civil War massively accelerated that. The big landowners were kicking everybody off the land. And that's really what led to the Industrial Revolution, because all these poor people needed some work, some money, some food, then they went to work in the factories. So this was a big effect on the world, the Civil War. It meant the British got their empire because of all these factories churning out ships and God knows what else. So that's actually an original pamphlet from the diggers at the end of the Civil War. And we went up as a group, we went up to where they had a squat in St George's Hill, which is the Beverly Hills of Britain. We went there in 1999 with about 300 or 400 people and took it over for a week. And we got a lot of publicity as a memorial to the diggers, because I think they would have understood. It was strange because in the Civil War it was just an ordinary piece of heathland, but now if you go there at St George's Hill in Surrey, it's the Beverly Hills of Britain. It's all big private estate, and so they didn't like us turning up, but it was a lot of fun. Okay, so go through history a little bit, and this is the sort of secret societies, I suppose you'd say, that are in charge in Britain and Europe. So this is the First World War. This is the family squabble that caused the First World War. The German Emperor, King George V and Tsar Nicholas II, all cousins. And they had a squabble and millions of people died. They had a dispute between each other. Now we move up to the Second World War. I'll just give you a chance to read that because it's pretty shocking. One of the worst things for British people, English people during the Second World War was the Blitz. Who started the Blitz? It was a brilliant idea of the former King, Edward VIII. He was talking to Nazi agents in Portugal and he suggested, look, you start bombing London, then you could come to an agreement with the British. What a great suggestion. That was the beginning of the Blitz. Thank you very much, King Edward VIII. And that's Edward, with his nice Masonic thing on. Very pretty. Winston Churchill as well, he was a Freemason. In fact, I went to Chartwell in Kent, which is where he lived during the Second World War. And I was listening to the talk from the National Trust, and I said, well, was Churchill a Freemason? He was, wasn't he? And he said, no, Churchill wasn't a Freemason. All these people from around the world that come to visit it. And so I got on my phone, and I said, there, look, it was in the Daily Mail from, say, something like 3 or 4 months previously. Churchill's Masonic writing equipment is up for auction. And I don't know whether he was just in denial, but he seemed, I mean, how do you know someone's not a Mason? How do you know? And how can you as a guide say, no, he definitely wasn't a Mason? But he was. And here is his famous quote. Anthony K. Brown, fantastic. I mean, there'll be quite a few books. If you want to get some notes out and scribble some of these books down, this is a terrific take by Anthony K. Brown on the Second World War, looking at some of the skullduggery going on. But it's a Churchill quote, isn't it? We must always, in wartime, the truth must always be covered with a bodyguard of lies. And that is most definitely true about Market Garden. So, just down the road from Winston, here is this chap. Very, very little known about, but Desmond Morton was the aide-de-camp to General Haig in the First World War. So he'd been in intimate touch with the top generals in the First World War at the end of that. He then became the head of Britain's Department for Economic Warfare between the wars. Morton had a relationship with Churchill. The question is, who was in charge? Churchill's in charge. Of course Churchill's in charge. This is his personal assistant. But if you go back to the records, you'll find when Churchill moved to Chartwell, which is his place of residence near Westerham in Kent, just down the road, already living there, was Desmond Morton. So that indicates to me that Churchill moved there to be near to Morton. They were only about a mile, maybe 3/4 of a mile apart. So this guy is the deep state, if you want. Churchill is the front man. Morton was a very, very powerful figure behind the scenes, with access to the king, constantly. This is up to today, okay? Now this is quite strange, isn't it? This is the Queen here, bless her, and here is her nurse, and this is her nurse's little brooch at the Masonic Hospital. This made a splash in the newspapers a couple of years ago in the UK. So this Masonic thing is running through the royal family as a way of keeping them in power. Here's another British Nazi. We had Edward VIII earlier. Montague Norman. He was the governor of the Bank of England during the Second World War. And he was making sure that Hitler had got the money he needed from the Bank of England during the war. And he was doing that at a place called the Bank for International Settlements in Basel in Switzerland, which at the end of the war they said, you must close this place down. But they never did. It's still there today. In fact, they built a beautiful new tower. So there's Montague Norman. He should not have been in charge. Actually, in the United States, they had a completely different arrangement with a guy called Henry Morgenthau, and he was in charge of the Treasury in the US, but he was 100% anti-Nazi. In Britain, no. Montague Norman was collaborating, should we say. This is just another, I'm throwing some of these things in here a little bit randomly, but this is really important to understand the collaboration between the United States and the Nazi genocide through lending them these machines. Now, people have never come across this book. Edwin Black's book is fantastic. What he's doing there is he's explaining how IBM were leasing these machines to the Nazis right the way through up until nearly the end of the war. And they had an IBM branch in Germany which was making sure that these punch cards could be used to profile people. And say, for example, the Gestapo decided they were going to get rid of the Jews in one city, they could have the card for the Jew and the card for the city, the location, and they could put them through the machine. They get a nice list up, every address to go to. So this is why surveillance today is a worry. Mass profiling of entire populations is a worry today. We should not have it, precisely because of this book, this reason. Henry Black, you'll find him around online, puts the case very, very firmly for privacy rights. What's happening is all our data is being sucked up. Well, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. Yes, you do, because your information should be private. In case someone comes along with a computer sometime in the future and says, this person of a particular, maybe a Muslim, in the city, we're going to arrest them all. They can do it nice and easily today with the power of modern computing. So we need our privacy, and that's why it's important. So let's get to the end of this question. Who gave permission for Bernhard to be, Prince Bernhard to be in on the planning? Remember the picture from earlier on. This is the guy that signed Bernhard's security pass. And I don't know if anyone recognises him, do they? Can I ask any question?
Ian Fleming.
Ian Fleming. This is, Ian Fleming was in naval intelligence in the Second World War, the famous Bond writer, and here he is. Interestingly though, he was told by the king to sign the certificate. He was told by Churchill, Bernhard is trustworthy, we can have him in the team. But you know what? He wouldn't sign the pass for the Royal Navy. So Bernhard was never trusted by the Royal Navy. He couldn't go into any naval establishments, and if he was to go onto a ship, he would have to seek the captain's permission. He had no special rights in the Royal Navy. And I'll tell you why that was. It's because Ian Fleming didn't trust him. Now, Ian Fleming's wages in the war were being paid by the admirals, right? Not by Downing Street, and not by the king, most importantly. So Fleming wouldn't allow Bernhard anywhere near the Navy. And there he is. That's a more recent picture, the sort of Bond years or something. So here we go. Here's the guy who said it's a good idea to have Bernhard in on the planning of Market Garden, in with the army and everything, and he is King George VI. There he is. And there he is with his little outfit too. Nice little apron. Beautiful. Now, I mean, this is a little bit more out there, but if you're looking at these world wars, I think it's important to check this guy out. Albert Pike was a senior Freemason in the Confederate Army in the American Civil War, and he was looking at revolutions as a way of changing society to manipulate it. Now, of course, if you're talking about something called a New World Order, which we don't hear enough people talking about, the Russians talk about it all right, but I do, of course, I will talk about the New World Order. You don't hear many people in BBC production offices talking about the New World Order, but you hear quite a lot of people down the pub will talk about it. This is what he's involved in here. So he's over in the United States, the New World, creating the New World, killing all those millions and millions, I think altogether something like 60, 70 million Native Americans, and creating this manufactured by Europe society, squashing the Native Americans out of the way. So here he is with his little plan to spread this control system. And I guess the Second World War, and since then we've seen that same control system which was instituted in the USA being instituted in other parts of the world. So, okay, so who gave permission? That's the question we're on at the moment still. And here they go. So they're off to, I'm not sure how much they knew about where they were going. They probably were told that they were going to Arnhem, Nijmegen or whatever. And certainly the senior officers would, but some of these guys were lambs to the slaughter because the people at the top didn't want this battle to succeed, and we'll talk a bit more about that. First of all, they've been betrayed by Bernhard right from the start. There is clear evidence that Bernhard was involved with this guy King Kong, but there is other evidence too. And there they go. These are the little airfields near where I live, around here, and up a bit further up. country, and off they went in the Dakotas and their gliders. Off over to you guys in the Netherlands here. To 101st Airborne to Eindhoven, 82nd Airborne to around Nijmegen, and the poor old 1st Airborne up in On. Some more little thing of what the routes were and all the different airfields they took off from. Mostly transport command. And down they come into, well, some of them came into a battle that they were expecting, others not. So, here is the amazing Colonel Pinto, the Dutch officer in the British Army, and I think it's probably time to hear now I have a friend, he's now a friend, a guy I interviewed years ago. He was, his father was in charge of transport for the 8th Army in Egypt. And he himself was in the SAS in Malaya, and he came out of the war. After Malaya, he worked for the first independent television companies in Britain, and was one of the people who was helping to think up stories for a series called The Avengers, which a lot of people will remember, which is a terrific bit of television. I wish we still had the same kind of thing today. Now, can you just play, please, Barry? Yeah, Barry's little, this is his...
I had lunch with a man called Colonel Pinto. There was a very popular BBC programme called Spycatcher. And he was a Dutchman, and he worked for the British. He told me this story, that he and his team were the people that went behind the British Army in Holland, and what they did was to get hold of all the people when the officials and everything else, put them into camps to then sort them out and find out whether there are any Nazis or people of, risky character. He had a number 2 who had a photographic memory. He could say to him, so-and-so, so-and-so, what we know about him, and he'd be able to almost recite it off straight away. Very good number 2. Anyway, the story is this man told me. They were going through the people that they were capturing at that time, and he that night went out for dinner. When he came back, it was sort of, I don't know, late in the night, 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock like that, and he went up towards the gates for his camp, where all these people were imprisoned temporarily, to check them all out before they were released. And the English sentry, who had just an ordinary rifle, was standing outside there, being harassed and having a hell of an argument and a thing with a great tall man, big man, with 2 girls on his arms. And when the sentry saw Colonel Pinto coming, he said, Sir. So Pinto walked across, a very experienced man, you see, and looked at this big chap standing there, you see, and what's going on here? He said, sir, this man's tried to take 2 of these girls from inside the camp out. I'm not allowed to let them go. And he said, and this chap stood with Schmeiser on one thing, Luger automatics on another, grenades and God knows what, you see. So Pinto looked at him and said, what's your name? And he said, King Kong. King Kong. He was boasting, of course, you see. But what his real name was, Lindemann Christians. This man was a bully and very big. Pinto was not, you see. And he noticed that he had a captain's pips on his arm, on his sleeve. And when this man was threatening the colonel...
What, you mean for a British Army captain?
Yes, you see. But yes, so the Dutchman, King Kong, had got his pips here on the sleeve, which of course you can't have. And so when he was trying to browbeat the colonel, he went forward and grabbed the things and pulled them off him and said, how dare you have your pips on your sleeve? And when he did that, the man shrunk because he was found out, you see. And he went off, and the 2 girls were put back in again. Next morning, Pinto went into his office. This is first hand, I can tell you. Went into his office and said to this number 2, what do we know about King Kong? Oh, he said, it's the famous Réseau. Réseau, that is a defense, a partisan gang, as it were. A Réseau in France. And who was in this Réseau? It was run by a man called Lindeman's Christians. He said, we'll do immediate checks on this man. And they started doing checks for several hours on his background. What they found out, that this Rezo was betrayed, and every man in it was killed, with one exception, Lindemann Christians. So he said, let's look at it. We must immediately go and get an arrest warrant, and we'll go to his camp and arrest this man. We've got to look into him. So they got the warrant, went across to the Dutch headquarters there, you see, and went in, spoke to the duty officer, whatever it is, we've got a warrant here for a man called Lindemans Christians. We want to interrogate him. Oh, I said, you can't interrogate him. He's the head of the King Kong Rezo. He's one of the top patriots in our country. They said, nevertheless, we wish to interrogate him. And they said, no, you will have to have a much more higher arrest warrant than this. And it will have to be with a counter stamp of the Netherlands. You've got a British one. You're in Holland now and you will need this. So he said, right, we'll get it. So they left. And it took them a day to get it. Following morning, he went back, Colonel Pinto, with his number 2, with a properly filled in warrant for the arrest. And when they went in, they said, well, it's terribly sorry, it's late. He's gone on a mission. Mission was to tell the Germans of the British invasion of Arnhem, Operation Market Garden. He betrayed them. Lindemann's Christian. But he was the one that let the Germans know, and they had their reserve units there, as you know. They knew 24 hours beforehand what was going to happen. A man who I went to Libya with, he was a private in 6th Airborne Division. He said, we entrained 5 times to go to the rescue of Arnhem. We had all the aircraft ready, and we entrained, but each time it was cancelled. So we were ready to go and help. In my opinion, we should have gone without any doubt. Landed behind them. If I would have given every tank commander a Sten gun and a rifle and said, we'll walk. It's only 10 miles to get to those men on those bridges. They held out for all those days, you know, John Frost for 5 days against Panzer tanks, and that was it.
So that's Barry Wynne. And that's his testimony. He's somebody who met Pinto and got to know him. So this is where I think it's. So someone tell me how you pronounce this. The Dutch. It's a prison where Lindemans so-called committed suicide after the war. Scheveningen or something.
Scheveningen. Oranje Hotel.
What?
Oranje Hotel.
A hotel.
No. That's a nickname.
Nickname.
So what's that in English?
Prison.
Prison hotel.
Yeah.
No, Scheveningen prison, nicknamed the Orange Hotel.
Ah, the Orange Hotel, okay. So that's where he so-called committed suicide, but of course there are still questions about whether he was murdered or not. Obviously there was a massive cover-up took place after that whole business, because it's just quite clear that all of the records disappeared. This is one of the. There are a few. I just did a list on my presentation here about all the different reasons why we know that this was a cover-up. Okay, so Dutch intelligence were warned that Lindemans must not be trusted, but he's assigned a top-secret mission. Okay, very strange. On the same day Pinto's informal investigation begins, Lindemans is transferred from the Dutch camp in Windhoek. So the same day the investigation begins, he suddenly disappears. Despite further evidence Pinto presents to them, British counterintelligence prevent him arresting Lindemans. They use the words, it is absurd and in doubtful taste. Detailed plans for Market Garden, because this is the myth about the glider, are very unlikely to have accompanied any troops, precisely because they might be found in a crashed glider. Stories conflict also about the location of the crashed glider, which was, I think, a cover story. I'm speculating here, but it seems pretty likely. for the Lindemans and from the Bletchley Park decrypts. Some sources say it was Vught, near Eindhoven, where this glider crashed. Others say it was Groesbeek, but it can't have been both. They're 40 miles apart. So maybe a cover story. Also, after his outburst to senior officers at Dutch intelligence headquarters, and despite his rank of colonel, old Pinto had all of his staff removed, all of his translators and his transport when this happened. So the guy's just completely stripped of all his ability to do his job at the time of Operation Market Garden. Following up the incident, the Arnhem incident in December 1944, Pinto was taken seriously ill with a mystery illness, returned to England, and took him several months to recover. He was taken ill in December. While Pinto's ill, as I said, all records there ever had been a King Kong investigation, including all the files of his interrogations in Britain, disappeared. They all disappeared from SHAFE headquarters. The trial of Lindemans, Christian Lindemans, was delayed indefinitely. And in 1950, under pressure from The Hague, Pinto was prevented from publishing the King Kong story in the British national paper, the Sunday Dispatch. Then, I've got a copy of it over there, in 1969, a fabricated version of the story was published called The Lindemans Affair, written by someone called Anne Lawrence, which admits that Lindemans was a spy, but she says that he was unable to tell the Abwehr anything. So, which doesn't really make any sense at all to me. Right. And so he became a successful author after he got the Spy Catcher book published in 1952, a fascinating account of all the interrogations that were going on in London, right the way through the Second World War, of suspicious characters that arrived on the shore or in aircraft or were picked up by the police. If they thought there was any suspicion they might be a spy, it was Pinto's job to discover whether they were or not. Okay, another important question, number 4. We're getting through these. I better go a bit quicker, maybe. Yeah. So this is the big question. It's who cut the wires? There's the explosives. But actually, this is one of the easiest questions to answer. Although for historians, they seem to have found it impossible. If you look at the historical record, it's quite obvious who cut the wires. And this is the British afterwards. There's quite a lot of explosives here, yeah, and these mines as well clustered around them. Here's the guy that did it. At least not him personally, is Captain Moffat Burries, I Company from, I think it's 504th Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. He was one of my heroes of Arnhem, because he did everything he could to win the battle. And he took his own initiative as well. Here's a quote from his book, Strike and Hold. And there he is, this is a more modern version of Moffat Burries. At sundown, he says, we found ourselves under the shadow of the massive Nijmegen Bridge, which rose nearly 20 stories above us. This is just after they crossed the Nijmegen, the Waal at Nijmegen, and against all odds, the 82nd Airborne had got to the other side of the bridge. I mean, it's an amazing piece, one of the most so-called most heroic things of the Second World War, taking that Nijmegen Bridge. He said he lost half his company. I'm not sure, I think we might have some audio. Anyway, he says, the Dyke Road ran under the north end of the bridge, which was supported by huge concrete columns. An eerie silence had fallen at the north end, and we didn't see any enemy troops. Could it be the Germans posted no defence at this end of the bridge, which is a bit peculiar? Across the river, the city of Nijmegen was ablaze, and there was a great deal of firing around the bridge's south end. As I stood beneath the north end, I saw a set of concrete steps that went from the lower road to the main highway at that end. Well, those concrete steps have gone now. There's been a massive reorganisation down there, rebuilding of it. I told Sergeant Leo Murray to take some men and cut any wires they saw around the supporting columns. This is his own initiative, he's done this. We didn't want the Germans to blow up the bridge because we needed it to be intact when the British tanks crossed the river. So, what I say is, could that eerie silence that he encountered at the north end of Nijmegen Bridge, B, because the Germans knew the whole thing was about to blow up and they didn't want to be hanging around. And what Harmel says, he was the Nazi commander who was interviewed by Colonel Kershaw in his book It Never Snows in September. He says, enemy tanks on the bridge. As soon as I saw them, only one course of action remained, as he later recalled. I now gave the order on my own responsibility to blow the road bridge, over which further tanks continued to advance. It failed to go up. And he says, this is the German General Harmel, probably because the initiation cable had been cut by artillery fire. Now, if you take what Burris is saying, he's saying, when my men got to the top, we cut the wires and the tanks started coming, right? So that is just before Harmel says he saw the tanks coming, now it's time to blow the bridge up. And there's, that's what that account I've just read from you by Moffat Burris is. So it's pretty clear that Moffat Burris was, and his men, particularly the guys who he calls Leo Murray, in order to cut those wires just before the tanks came. So there's a lot more tanks coming now, because in fact someone's waving me down here. Hi guys, and lots of them are starting to come across Nijmegen Bridge. A whole row of them. So this is the bunker where Harmel was looking, and this I guess where he gave the order to blow the demolition charges at the time. So that was Moffat Burris, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. And his men, the 82nd Airborne, who just crossed. Even more tanks coming now. Look, all across Nijmegen Bridge now. How far is it? Now, the key thing in the battle, from a military point of view, was that all of the German defences were preparing to blow the bridge. So they were saying, as soon as we see tanks, we're going to blow the bridge up. That meant that all of their forces had been sent into Nijmegen to defend inside Nijmegen. So when these tanks started to come over here, there was very little in the way of defence. So there we are with those guys again. So the next question, and the biggest question I think probably of the whole battle, is this one. This is from Moffat Burris's book. There's Carrington there, and this is a commemoration of the battle in 1994. Carrington died just a few months ago, weeks ago, and I tried to interview him. He would not reply to any of my contacts to interview him. So there he is doing his little thing in a tank, but he was the guy that didn't go anywhere. Okay, so he came across the bridge in Nijmegen and then just ground to a halt. At this point, I think we better have that bit of audio. Well, sorry, it's the video, isn't it, from A Bridge Too Far, which is, where is it? There, that one. Just a short clip from the film.
What's the matter with you guys?
Those are British troops at Arnhem. They're hurt, bad. You're not gonna stop. Not now.
I'm sorry, we have our orders.
We busted our asses getting here, half my men are killed, and you're just gonna stop? And drink tea?
But we're now facing a completely different situation. We can't leave with tanks up that road. Jerry will pick us off like sitting ducks. Our infantry is still fighting in Nijmegen. When they get here, we'll move on.
For Christ's sake, let's you do everything but a book.
Our orders are to wait for the infantry. I'm sorry, but there it is.
Another thing to point out is these tanks sitting around. They're a perfect target for the German anti-tank guns, and they're a perfect target for the Sturmgeschütz tank destroyers. You do not, if you're facing any kind of armoured resistance, the last thing you do in a Sherman tank is sit around. You don't, because you've got to keep moving. The anti-tank guns, they can't traverse. It's difficult for them to, and the Sturmgeschütz is the same. If you want to turn a Sturmgeschütz, the tank destroyer, you've got to use the tracks. You've got to start up the engine and you've got to turn the thing like this. So it's got a bit of traverse. So it was idiotic to stop. Absolutely idiotic, just from a military point of view. Lots of excuses have come out over the years why people think that is the case. Right. So this is the question, isn't it? And who's this? Oh, I think this is General Browning here. So this is when 30 Corps comes up to Nijmegen. They start to have conversations. Gavin, I think that is there. They're having conversations about what are we going to do now. So they've got across the Nijmegen Bridge, but they decided to stop. Now there's every excuse is used. We've run out of ammunition. We've run out of petrol. It's getting dark, actually. That's a big advantage if it's dark, because it's very difficult for the Germans to get a range on you and shoot at you. Okay, so it's not so easy to find the road, and also you might have to have a light on your tank, which the anti-tank gun can focus on. But it could be seen as a real advantage to move forward in the dark. We now know it's about 20 minutes for a Sherman tank to get up that road. This is Horrocks here, who was in charge at the time, the Monty. And these are the little boats they'd use to get across. This is a bit out of all of this, but it's important to have those. So anyway, this is my attempt to solve the conundrum of why those tanks stopped there. Is this place in Brussels, the Hotel Maison Rouge. The previous month, I think it was the 20th of August, there was a very important meeting here of all the Nazi industrialists. They were sent there by Hitler's treasurer and the head of the Nazi party, Martin Bormann. And in the hotel, the Red House Hotel, and the Red House meeting, all the plans had been agreed for after the war, because these industrialists were not interested in losing their industries and their wealth. They made big plans to make sure that that was secreted around the world, mainly in Switzerland, Argentina, places like this. And that gave them a lot of bargaining chips with the Allies. They didn't want to be killed in a bunker in Berlin. Of course they weren't going to. And many of those industrialists had already many subsidiary companies in foreign countries. So they were just moving all the wealth from bank accounts into other countries. But they were doing deals, and they had a lot of chips to do those deals with. One of the most important ones, of course, is the loot of the whole of Europe. Right? So they've been going through the bank vaults all over Europe, taking all the money. They've been going through people's houses, picking up any kind of loot, wealth. There's bearer bonds, which were a major currency, which is a kind of share certificate, which is like money. So, say I've got, £100,000 worth of shares in Shell, I can give you that certificate, and that's £100,000 cash, basically. So the bearer bonds were an important part of the wealth the Nazis had. So this was the final signing off on the agreement across Nazi Germany for them to survive the war. Well, and it's not just me saying this. Here's the American intelligence report all about it. Plans of German industrialists to engage in underground activity after Germany's defeat, the flow of capital to neutral countries. So these deals began in August 1944. Market Garden, unfortunately, was a bit more than a month after that, so those deals were already being done. This is a very important book when you're understanding what happened on the island between Nijmegen and Arnhem. It Never Snows in September, which is Robert Kershaw's book, where he interviews the Nazi leaders. Very important, I think. I mean, and also he's a very nice guy, Kershaw. He was a British Army colonel who was serving in the British Army on the Rhine, and the German soldiers would come up to him and poke him and say, "Hey, you missed the trick at Arnhem, right? You British?" Because they'd heard through their own armed forces the truth of the battle, which was that there was nothing between Nijmegen and Arnhem capable of stopping those tanks. And he has the hard evidence of this, okay? This is Harmel, he was put in charge of the defence of Nijmegen, because the Battle of Arnhem really isn't the Battle of Arnhem. That's another thing to say. It was the Battle of Nijmegen. That was where the decisive part of the battle took place, and the Germans knew it. That's why the main general on the ground at the time was concentrating on Nijmegen. He was going to stop them getting over that Nijmegen bridge, and it's also why he was ready to blow that Nijmegen bridge up. Quite horrible. And Robert Kershaw says that when he interviewed him in the 1980s, before he died, Harmel was puffing on a big cigar. Oh, you made a big mistake. And hopefully I've got a little quote of Harmel. Yeah. The 4 panzers, he says, who crossed the bridge, made a mistake when they stayed in Lent. If they carried on their advance, it would have been all over for us. So that's from the horse's mouth, from the general himself, who was in charge of the German defences. And Kershaw says in his book, it's quite possible the Allies, I'm not sure, some of this is Harmel, some of this is Kershaw. It's quite possible the Allies might have been able to feed a battle group into Arnhem before the road was finally blocked again. During the first night of the 20th and 21st of September, there were only security pickets reinforced by 1 or 2 outposts in position. The situation continued until Knaust finally arrived in force on the afternoon of the 21st. For 5 hours between 1900 and midnight, the road was totally clear. And we also know now that it was probably until the next day, because I was chatting to the people in Arnhem, they said that the John Frost's people only finally surrendered at 11 a.m. the next day. So that's about 18 hours you've got to get those, because the Frost being at the bridge, you could stop the German armour coming across down this direction. So for 5 hours, he says, anyway, between 1900 and midnight on the 20th, the road was clear. Nothing of substance could close it until Knaust arrived. Frost's forces were overwhelmed just as the window of opportunity closed. How interesting. So they decided to start going at the wrong time. So anyway, this was why the Germans couldn't get down to Nijmegen across the Arnhem Bridge, because it was littered with all this mess that Frost had made of the reconnaissance battalion. All these were just in the way, and the Germans couldn't get their tanks through there. And also, of course, you've got by the side of the Arnhem Bridge here, you've got the British firing their anti-tank things at them, and they've got anti-tank, at least one anti-tank gun as well. So it was completely impossible for them to get down to Nijmegen. They had to use the Paladin ferry, which was almost impossible. Well, you couldn't get the tanks on the ferry. Apparently you could get the tank destroyers, but you couldn't get the tanks on the ferry. So that is a very dark picture. Sorry about that. But that's in the book, and it shows the evidence. There's Arnhem, and there's Nijmegen, and here is the road, and this is the artillery map from the Germans that shows where the defences were. So there's a few down here in Lent, there's the road, nothing until one here, and one here in Elst, and there's the rest of the road going up to Arnhem. There's virtually nothing there. And Sergeant Robinson, in his Grenadier Guards tank, had managed to get through all these. He got to there. So that's why there's such a controversy about the lack of movement. So there's your tank, Sherman Firefly, and how fast are they going? Pretty fast, 22 miles an hour. And so these are the guys that should have been rumbling but weren't. There's his quote of Brigade Führer Harmel. Carrington again. So another picture of the burrows. So this is what the Americans proposed. They said, okay, we'll jump on your tanks and we'll go. But no, Carrington was having none of that. And here is Carrington in the 1980s when he was the Defence Secretary and then Foreign Secretary. He was Defence Secretary for Edward Heath, Foreign Secretary for Margaret Thatcher. And then, of course, he went on to NATO, become Secretary General of NATO, and in the 1990s, for I think it was 5-6 years, the chairman of the Bilderberg group. So he is also from the hotel. But he didn't go to that hotel, but he became the Bilderberg chairman. So here's the guy who was sitting in his tank and wouldn't go anywhere, and the American Moffat Burris, the hero of the Vile crossing, pointed his gun against his head and said, go. Now, he denies that ever took place, but he wouldn't be interviewed. And there's another picture of Carrington. I don't know where I found this, but it's quite weird, isn't it? This is the Green Man, and here's a pair of scissors. What's he up to then? This is a Stormgeschütz. That's one of these. See that this gun can't go from side to side. So this is what was waiting. Now let's get on to the Hexenkessel. Here it is, and this is where we are now, isn't it? Down here. So the Witch's Cauldron, which is also very near here, which is where that those Bilderberg meetings started too. These two, there's a bit of a, I don't know if you can sense the body language there, but here is the Polish General Sosabowski, who was so messed about so appallingly by General Browning. And the result was that basically Browning ordered, first of all, Browning was one of the major villains of this because he just kept messing about and he wasn't taking the battle seriously. First of all, one of the most important things is, as the officer in charge of this operation on the ground, he didn't even come to Arnhem. He went to Nijmegen, to Oosterbeek. He decided, I'm going to land in Oosterbeek. What did he know about what was going to happen in Arnhem? Why didn't he, as the general in charge of this battle, why didn't he go to Arnhem? He decided, I'm going to go to Oosterbeek Heights. Yeah, I better start racing through this now, don't I? So what happened to the Nazi loot? Another big question around the background to what Market Garden. So we talked just now about the Red House meeting. This is Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's treasurer. Effectively, he was the signatory on the bank accounts. It was him that had Adolf Hitler's will at the end of the war, that sort of thing. A very handsome guy. And here is Desmond Morton. Now, these two were in touch with each other. And it's quite clear now that Churchill's personal assistant and Martin Bormann, if you're looking at the historical record as I've done, that these two people were very much in touch. He was one of the key guys behind that Red House meeting, and he was also the signatory on all the money. So he was a key person that the British had to, or the traitors, once the British, had to deal with if they wanted a bit of slice of the Nazi money at the end of the war. There's another thing that he had as a bargaining chip too. This is the date here, 23rd of February last year. So Nazis tested a nuclear bomb before the end of World War II. The Nazis had enriched uranium at the end of the Second World War. This was in a way more valuable than money. The Americans wanted to try out their nuclear bombs, which the British actually was Frisch-and-Piles in Nuffield, Birmingham University, that invented the atomic bomb. A couple of Eastern European nuclear scientists said, if you do this and this and this is going to go bang. And Churchill gave that technology to the Americans and said, we don't have the resources to develop this, but you do, so go and develop the atomic bomb. And then at the end of the war, the Americans came back to the British and said, well, we've developed it now, but you can't have any of the information. And so the British then developed their own atomic bombs in the late 1940s. But this was a massively important bargaining chip. The Americans would do anything for enriched uranium at the end of World War II in Europe. And now, this is actually, yeah, so the biggest manhunt in history apparently for Martin Bormann, the guy who was so close to Hitler and was running things from behind the scenes. Now, he was countermanding Hitler's orders. For example, Hitler ordered everything must be destroyed, scorched earth policy. So, for example, he wanted all the bridges destroyed, all of the factories burnt. Bormann had another plan. He wanted to hand those factories over to the Allies, and because he knew that the German industrialists would be taking them on in a few months' time, in a few years' time. So Bormann was countermanding Hitler's orders probably for the last at least 6-8 months of the war, quietly. Here's Bormann again. And this is why I think it's quite an important book here, because this is about the British taking Bormann out secretly at the end of the war. The last few weeks of the war, a whole commando unit took Bormann out. And this is the guy who met Bormann just as you come into the British sector at the end of World War II. Desmond Morton again. So Bormann and Hitler, Bormann and Himmler. Bormann's everywhere. This guy also has a fantastic book on Bormann. There's a lot of rubbish written about Bormann. This is a really good one. New investigation of the escape and survival of Nazi war criminals. So there was a massive manhunt for Bormann, and yet suddenly in the 1970s they decided, oh, it's okay, he never escaped anyway. But he was taken to Britain, and then when the Khrushchev was visiting Britain, he was then spirited away to South America. Bormann was. Now there's a lot of stuff at the moment about, here he is again. There's a lot of stuff about, this is one of his little sayings, which sums him up in a way, I think. Every educated person is a future enemy. Now I can't source that quote, I've tried, but this is all over the place online as a quote from Bormann. So who went in to get him? Well, Ian Fleming did, and John Ainsworth Davis, who died a couple of years ago. Now I've met people who've met John. He was in charge of this operation, and he was the author of the book Op JB, even though he uses a pen name, because he was worried he was going to be arrested under the Official Secrets Act. But these two guys were involved in the planning. He was in charge of the whole main person in charge of the operation. And there he is again. The guy that trained, I've got a special slide for him, because he was Commander Golding, and it was his units down in HMS Northney, they called it, which is down in Hayling Island near Portsmouth, which trained the commandos. There's something like 50 or 70 commandos that went in to get Bormann, and they were trained by this guy. He was the officer commanding them. And Golding was one of those guys that he leads with his men. He would have been in Arnhem if he'd have been Browning, for example. He always went with his men. He did more raids on the French coast during World War II for the Royal Navy than any other single individual, which is why he got his DSO. He was doing raids all the time. And if you've got questions, can you just wait till the end, please? Just at the end, yeah. So here, this is his. So this is just some evidence about Combined Operations Headquarters writing to the family. They were trying to find out what he'd done during the war, because about 5 weeks after the end of World War II, he died. He was only 41 years old. But my reading of the situation is that he wasn't happy about the way his commandos had been used to go and get Bormann. And he was likely to kick up a fuss about it. And so he was no longer required, even though he was one of the great war heroes. He was an inconvenient person who knew about the way the commandos had been used to go and get Bormann. There he is with his fellas in the canoe. And they were doing the things like the raiding parties, so there he is again with his son. That's Jill's dad. Now, the reason we have some pretty good ideas that Op JB, the book, is a true account is because Milton Schulman, he was a Jewish reviewer of books and plays for the London Evening Standard. In his autobiography, he devotes a whole chapter to how he helped get that book published and all the difficulties they had to go through, including death threats, publishers changing their mind at the last minute to get Op JB published. So I suggest you read the book if you're interested in the background to Market Garden. Another thing that's in that book is the fate of this Dutch submarine, KXB-11, which spotted the Japanese fleet going to Pearl Harbor. They radioed through. We've spotted a Japanese fleet through the periscope. They're coming to Pearl Harbor. The only trouble was Pearl Harbor was supposed to be a surprise attack. So John Ainsworth Davis, in his book, says he was sent to take them a load of Christmas presents at the end of 1941. And those Christmas presents, as soon as they got clear of the submarine, they turned out to be explosives and cyanide gas. So all the people in this Dutch submarine were murdered because they knew that Pearl Harbor was not a surprise attack and they couldn't be allowed to, because of course they would think of themselves as heroes. We saved the day, we told everyone they were coming, but that wasn't the right story. And you know, this is in part of his testimony. There's another picture of the submarine in Newsweek. Funnily enough, a few months after it had been sunk by the British. And this is another important part of the story of Bormann, because this is Paul Manning. He covers what happened to Bormann over in South America. Paul Manning worked for CBS News, and during the World War II he was reporting for the American radio listeners on the war in Europe. And this is a fantastic book. I mean, this is one of the very little known about books, but it was pointed out to me by a former MI6 officer called Harry Beckhoff, who worked in secret intelligence in Egypt, with Bletchley Park. And after the war, he was one of the main people who went around Europe to big cities doing a denazification program. That is to say, rooting out all of the Nazis that were still in positions in universities, in the press, any powerful position in local authorities, government of any sort. And Harry's job was to get rid of them. In fact, he sometimes found that they were able to push back. So he was trying to get rid of some top professor in Cologne University, and he suddenly found that he was being castigated in the House of Commons. Someone saying, "How dare you impute the relationship, the integrity of this professor?" And questions are being asked in the House of Commons. But this guy was a Nazi, and eventually he proved it, and he got the guy removed. So Harry died about 4 or 5 years ago now, but he was him that told me about this book, and it was one of the most fascinating things I've ever read. So there you go. This was also an expose in the 1970s in the Daily Mail, which is known as Farrago. But no, apparently he died. But did he or not? This is a bit more about Bormann. This is I think it's called Berchtesgaden. And so Bormann, one of the reasons Hitler loved Bormann and trusted Bormann is because he built a lot of this complex, the Eagle's Nest, which is where Hitler liked to hang out, right on the Swiss border. And it was all commissioned by Bormann. And these buildings were built not physically by him, but he was in charge of their architecture and everything. And here is, on this little road between Hitler's Eagle's Nest and where Bormann lived, is this little tree. It's called the Bormann tree. Right? And that is when it was quite small. There's a bit from the Bormann tree. I mean, they keep these almost like some sort of religious relic, for God's sake. And here is the tree growing nicely after the war. But what happened with Bormann, these are some good books about it, but there's all sorts of these other things that have come out, Hunting, Hitler. All these came out, this one particularly, after this was published, this one here was published, OpJB, there were all these various spoilers came out, like, oh, it wasn't Bormann that survived the war, Hitler survived the war. And this is just rubbish. In order to cover the real facts, which is this book here, and these ones. Those are the three main ones, I'd say. This is an extremely good read. If you're interested in the backstory of the Second World War, William Stevenson's Man Called Intrepid is really fascinating, because he interviewed the people who were working with Churchill and Roosevelt in 1938 to win the war. And this is another part of it all, of course, isn't it? We wanted the technology from Nazi Germany. Operation Paperclip. The paperclips were put on the files, and that meant you can't prosecute this guy because we need him, we want his knowledge and technology. So hundreds of Nazi war criminals escaped justice because the Americans wanted the technology. They wanted what was in their heads. This is the background against which Market Garden was being fought. This mentality that we need to take the best from Hitler's Nazi Germany, and they're going to become our friends after the war in a Cold War against the Russians. So, another question about Bilderberg, which is on my list. We're getting through the list. Which Germans were at the first Bilderberg meeting, 1954? Now, he's a nice looking guy. CDU, I don't know who he is. And the point being, who is this guy? If you'd have come to the first Bilderberg meeting, you would have been thinking the same. Who is this guy? Now, back in the 1950s, very little was known about many of these individuals who were at the Bilderberg conferences up the road, or started up the road. But who is this guy? There's your hotel. We had a little wander around yesterday. They've just got a new, if you haven't seen it recently, they've just got a new entranceway here with pictures of Paul Rikens, Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller and Prince Bernhard. Beautiful pictures in there. So they're very proud to have a whole bunch of organised criminals meeting at their hotel and starting a series of international criminal meetings. So here's Leverkusen. This is what we now know about him. Okay, he was at the first Bilderberg meeting. Yes, he's a banker during the war. So what was his role as a banker in Germany? But he was the boss of an arms manufacturer, and he was defending the Nazis at Nuremberg. The people from Britain and America that went to the first Bilderberg meeting, I bet they didn't know that about him. Because this stuff has only come out more recently about who these people were. He's probably the worst of the lot of the Bilderbergers from the 1950s that we were all fraternising with. And here he is, Joseph Abs, Deutsche Bank chair, Bilderberg, 1958. Now that's during the war, right? So he was one of the key Nazi financiers in World War II, and there we are sitting down, let's have a nice chat. The other thing that Abs was doing, when he was at Deutsche Bank, and Manfred Petrich, in his All Smoke and Mirrors blog, has pointed this out, is it was his job in Deutsche Bank to go through and find all the Jewish accounts to take the money from. Because the Nazi government had passed a law to say anyone who has a Jewish bank account, all the money is coming to the Nazi party. Or for taxation, is empty all their accounts. And this is the guy that job it was to do that. So there he is sitting at the Bilderberg meetings. How about that for treachery? And I suppose it's chutzpah, really, the cheek to do something like that, to be sitting down with your former enemies. Now, Klaus Kopp from Hamburg, Klaus managed to interview one of the first, the secretary for one of the people who went to the first Bilderberg meeting in 1954. And what she told Klaus was, I remember this guy turning up to invite, I think it was Rudolf Müller, who was the guy that founded the newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in the 1940s. This is the guy that turned up to invite Rudolf Müller to the first Bilderberg meeting. Does anyone recognise him? He's a very handsome cardinal. No, this is Frings. Cardinal Frings, the Cardinal of Hanover. And what a marvellous thing, because he was quite outspoken about the Nazis, but the Nazis didn't dare to touch him right the way through the war. So wasn't the Catholic Church working with the Nazis? I think they were. I think that many of the Nazis, war criminals, at the end of the war escaped using Catholic rat lines, I seem to remember, down to places like the Tyrol in Austria. So they were working with the Nazis. So here is a guy who comes to invite the people to the first Bilderberg meeting. Quietly comes in. He doesn't go to the Bilderberg meeting himself, but he's the guy that comes and says, please will you come to the Bilderberg? And obviously the rest is history with Bilderberg. Bilderberg is being involved in, this is a quote from one of the attendees at Bilderberg. The Treaty of Rome was nurtured at Bilderberg. Okay, so here we go. We're getting there. What does an extra 5 months of World War II mean today? Okay, go back to the Red House meeting. Because here was a meeting which was really about international organised crime. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all this Nazi loot and we're going to use it and secrete it around to these nice businesses. If you go back to the previous slide about Bormann, his plan, in fact this is what he did, is he created 750 corporations, and into those corporations after the war, he got all the SS people and he said, take off your SS uniform, put on a nice suit, we're going to make you on the board of directors of this company. And the money was laundered through Sullivan and Cromwell, mostly, was laundered through Sullivan and Cromwell, the Dulles Brothers law firm in New York, and put into those businesses. So this was their secret international organised crime network of big business. And they had massive amounts of money to draw on in order to let those businesses grow after the war. The other thing that Bormann was very clever in doing, and he talks about in that Paul Manning book, was to put Jews on the boards of directors, sometimes as chairman, because nobody would suspect that a organised crime, Nazi-funded business would be fronted by a Jewish person. But let's face it, there is, I think there is Jewish organised crime as well as other sorts of organised crime. So that was one of his aims, was to make sure that nobody recognised that those businesses were anything to do with the Nazi loot. This is a guy, he actually phoned me up a few weeks ago. Idris Francis is his name, but this is his uncle, Idris Evans, preparing for the, that's him, that's his wife, 1946 Nuremberg tribunals, and this is the proof that he was there, right? And now we've got more proof as well. He's not making this up. A German general declared to his face, "Yes, you have beaten us for the second time." This is at Nuremberg, right? And this guy was he was escorting the prisoners at Nuremberg. "Yes, you have beaten us for the second time, but next time we will win. Next time it will all take place so slowly you won't know what's happening until it's all over." So what he's suggesting there is that a kind of Fourth Reich is being created, which is a financial empire. It's not tanks anymore, it's banks which are used. And you can take something over just as easily with a bank. If you want to take over a business, you want to take over a building, you don't need to use a tank. You come and buy it up. You offer an amount of money for it. For example, if it's on the stock exchange, you can just buy the shares and you've bought the business. So a bank in many ways is a much more subtle way to create an empire than a tank is. A tank's not very subtle, is it? This is also happening after World War II. Winston Churchill is completely potty, in fact. He's talking about on the BBC because most of it was live in those days, we must nuke Moscow, so that they had to keep him off the BBC. Where did he get the money to build the bomb? This is another question. Because apparently it wasn't passed through Parliament, but in the 1950s, I think it was 52, I can't remember exactly when, Churchill popped up. He'd been in obscurity, he was kicked out of Parliament, of course, by the Labour victory in 1945, and he said, "Hey, guess what? I built the atomic bomb." And everyone's, "Crikey, wow, that's amazing, but where did he get the money from?" That's an open question. I spoke to Graham Farmelow, who wrote this book, and he said, "That's one of the things I deal with in the book. It's a big mystery." The money, of course, it's millions and millions of pounds to build the first atomic bomb. You can't do it for nothing. Where did the money come from? But then this is another thread in all of this, and this is the Rhodes roundtable groups over the years. Carol Quigley here wrote this book, The Anglo-American Establishment, and another one which is Tragedy and Hope, thank you. And he explains how at the end of the 19th century, Cecil Rhodes had the plans for taking over the world. He thought the British Empire is now so big, just a little step more and we could take over the world. And this little dream of his, crazy dream, was why he in his will, he set up these roundtable groups. The idea was to set up think tanks, private think tanks in most of the Western countries who would be very powerful and influential and very well funded. In fact, more well funded, better funded than the government. Yeah, so more money than the Foreign Office. So that was his plan, the roundtable group, Cecil Rhodes. In the UK, it's called Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. This is another side to things. The CIA, creation of the CIA through the Dulles brothers. And this is one of the things, this is one of my little illustrations I did for the Bilderbergs, which is these two. Henry Kissinger is now one of the main people in Bilderberg, just about. And his picture's up at the hotel. He is one of the most serious war criminals on the planet that is still alive. There are some countries you can't go to, but it is incredible to me that so many people seem to think he's some kind of great guy. In fact, a lot of people in the media do, but he's behind so many coups. The obvious ones like Chile, Indonesia, there's more and more. The invasion of Cyprus by Turkey. This guy is just playing with us. When he was in the State Department, and ever since he's been an unofficial consultant to government. Another side of all this is the mob in the United States. There's this bank I was telling you about. For many years it was just a little chocolate shop, above a chocolate shop, but now it's proudly sitting there. This is where all the central bankers get together once a month and decide on regulation of the banking industry. Well, we've got a governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, from the Canadian Central Bank, but actually, for many years, he was here running the Regulation Committee for World Banking. So he was the guy whose bad regulation it was that caused the 2008 financial crisis. And now he's been promoted to become governor of the Bank of England. How perverse is that? There is no regulation. These guys, organised crime is not interested in regulation. They want to control, it's called control fraud. So if they can control the regulators, they can do what they want. And that's what they're doing right now. This is a terrific book about the Bank for International Settlements by Adam Moore. Various collaborators. Now this is just a little section here on a guy called Michael Tyler. Now Michael lives on a canal boat in Northamptonshire in England, and when I interviewed him last year, I said to him, how many people have interviewed you about the deaths of bankers under suspicious circumstances? He's done a list over a space, I think, 3 or 4 years, 70 senior bankers committed suicide or had terrible accidents. And here is a look at whereabouts those banks were. So, JP Morgan Chase, nearly 20% of the bankers died there, out of the 70. Then ABN AMRO, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, 3%, Goldman Sachs, 3%. But these are not investigated. These deaths have not been investigated. Some of the, for example, some guy is supposed to have shot himself repeatedly in the chest from a distance with some kind of staple gun that killed him in the bath. So some of the reports, when you read them, they don't make any sense. That can't be suicide. Shot twice in the head and suicide. How is that? So Michael Tyler has not been interviewed by anybody, apparently apart from me, in the whole world, and certainly not the mainstream media, about this amazing scandal of the apparent murders of scores and scores of top Western bankers. Now those bankers, I would suggest, are probably being murdered because they have some kind of conscience or some honesty. Cause of death. You can't really see that. But anyway, look, there's the spike. This is what Michael's done with it on his website. 2012, 2013, we've got 17. The middle of 2013, you've got 40 bankers dead, unnatural causes. I think he's done a fantastic job, Michael, I really do. And this is a Michael tribute to him. Terrorist finance, discreet and professional. Because in the US, former US Army psychological warfare officer, Scott Bennett, who's quite regularly on the Iranian TV, and I've got to know a bit, I've interviewed him a few times, when he was working for the Pentagon, he was uncovering money going through UBS to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and these various groups. UBS. UBS, of course, also were the people who, when there were Jewish accounts at UBS, they were shredding the evidence that the people had put the money there because they'd been killed by the Nazis in the war. They left it a few years and then they started shredding all the documents that said that those Jewish people had ever given them any money. So these people are organised crime, international organised crime. And a guy I know called Rowan Bosworth Davis, he's a former Scotland Yard fraud squad officer. He has published this report and he submitted it to Parliament. In fact, they kept denying that they had it, and he had to send the email and a registered letter something like 7 or 8 times before they admitted this government committee that they had his report. Why the British banking industry has become identical with an organised criminal enterprise. So we're talking here about LIBOR fraud, foreign exchange fraud, PPI mis-selling. No, mis-selling is a misnomer. It's fraud, and anyone that does it should be prosecuted and jailed if they're found guilty. But no, there is no real prosecution for fraud, false accounting anymore. Certainly amongst the top people. But it's a terrific report, this. I recommend if you get the time at some point, you read through it. Because he's just showing you, look, they are organised crime, British banking. someone else I've got to know a little bit. How bad journalism supports our bogus democracy. That's why I'm trying to do a little bit of good journalism. And here's a bogus democracy for you, that's the European Parliament. Because they don't really have any power. The real power is in the hands of the European Commission, which is made up mostly of failed politicians who are totally unelected. They're appointees. Okay, here's another aspect to all of this, which is the euro notes. Now, what's going on here with the 500 euro note? That's a Europe, and that's a bridge. What we've got here is the Atlantic Bridge. And that's what the European Union, I think, is all about, and what the deals that were being done in the war were really all about. So you've got a new world in America. They've successfully taken over. The United States is being controlled and run the way they want it. They want Europe to follow suit. So they need an Atlantic bridge. And that's really what Bilderberg has been doing since the 50s, in creating this Atlantic bridge so that the ideas of the controlled United States of America can be brought over for a United States of Europe. That was Bilderberg's mission, I think, after the war. And many people have, even people who have been there have said it. Now there's another note, again, there's Europe, there's the Atlantic Bridge. I don't see too many of these 200 euro, not as many as I'd like. Anyway, look, there's another one, the euro note, the Atlantic Bridge. The 50 euros, there's Europe, the Atlantic Bridge. I think I made my point. Every single one is the Atlantic Bridge. That's what the euro is about, and that's what Brussels is about. Henry Kissinger said, I don't want to phone up 30 different embassies, I want one embassy to phone to get what I want in Europe. So another bridge. We're running out of notes now, but here's the last one, there you go. See, off it goes to Europe. To the United States. I just put this slide up because it's a terrific read. I think this is the attitude of the elite, some of whom I've met, people like Jacob Wallenberg, who's the top banker in Sweden, through covering these Bilderberg conferences. They see it all as a big game. And we're going to be the winners. And everyone else is going to be the losers because we're so clever. They're very arrogant people. So where are we now with the battle? Okay, from Market Garden. The wonderful 82nd Airborne Division, Moffat Burrows was a hero. No doubt about that, they did a great job. They were steered over to Groesbeek by Browning, where they should have just gone straight for the bridge if Gavin, the general, had been able to do that. But Browning said, no, go to Groesbeek. So Browning was saying, go in the wrong direction. But this guy, he's from the 82nd Airborne Division, a more recent version from 1963. This was taken, I think, in 63 or 64. His name is James Files. He was trained as a sniper by the 82nd and fought in Korea. And here is a gun that he used to kill President Kennedy. So where are they now, the 82nd Airborne Division? Well, great, they killed their own president. He became a hitman for the Chicago mob when he left the 82nd, when he left the army. And here's the gun he used. It's called a Fireball, Remington Fireball, I think. And his testimony is very, very convincing. He talks all about all the details of it, who he was with, etc., and it all checks out. So this is Wim Dankbaar, as some of you would have heard of, as a Dutch journalist who was booted out of the mainstream journalism, a bit like me. And his interviews with James Files are fantastic. This is James Files now. He's in prison in the US being interviewed.
I think it's been paroled.
Has it? So, but if you say that sort of thing, what's going to happen to you? Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Oh, actually, you know what? I don't mind being called a conspiracy theorist at all because I know where the term comes from. The term comes from the CIA. After the Kennedy assassination, here is a memo from the CIA explaining Kennedy's assassination. There's been speculation about the responsibility of his murder, which of course we now know was done by the mob. It was done by Lyndon Johnson and one of the Dulles brothers, I can't remember which. Anyway, they made sure that the CIA, the FBI, and the vice president were all in on the murder so that there could be an easy cover-up. That's one of the things. If you want to assassinate a senior person in government, you've got to make sure that all the people that might investigate that murder are on your side beforehand. Then you can do it. That's why they didn't kill Kennedy in Chicago, because the DA in Chicago wasn't one of their friends. It was the district attorney in Dallas was in on the conspiracy. So that's why they did it in Dallas. So the idea is that people are getting to the truth about Kennedy. So we've got to come up with a term to label these people as conspiracy theorists. So this is the CIA here. And that's a bit of a closer version. Okay, so that was the 82nd Airborne. What about the parachute regiment here in Arnhem? Well, a little bit later, this is 1972 in Northern Ireland. You've got the Catholic population, the nationalist population more accurately, are denied the vote, a lot of them, so they're going on these civil rights marches. We want to be able to vote, please. And in 1972, the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment turn up and shoot dead 14 of these marchers. Not on this particular march, but that was the Parachute Regiment doing it. So the same guys, the same regiment that was here in Arnhem. That's not covering yourself in glory, shooting civilians, especially 14, and then starting a civil war in Northern Ireland that lasts for 25 years and kills thousands and thousands of people on the nationalist side and the unionist side, and divides the entire country. So that was the Paras in 1972. But who was in charge of the Paras? Who was Defence Secretary? Lord Carrington. This is a very important book. When you're looking at terrorism in Europe, it's NATO's secret army. Danny Eleganza, what he shows is that NATO intelligence services were doing that sort of thing all over Europe, that they were doing it, that Paris did in Ireland. So blowing up people, innocent people in Italy, in Belgium, in Germany too, and the Swiss, the Italians and the Belgians, all governments all had inquiries into it and proved that. I mean, he quotes those inquiries, Daniel Eleganza here. So NATO is not benign. What it's doing from its headquarters in Brussels is blowing us up, us Europeans up, and then pointing the finger at the Russians and saying, we've got to watch out for these left-wing crazies. But actually NATO is doing the killing. There's Bologna railway station, 1980, nearly 100 innocent Italians were murdered. And the attempt was to blame it on the Red Brigades. Actually, it was a NATO bomb. That's Bologna again. And we go on to 9/11. Well, we're coming up a bit more closer to now, aren't we? This is the BBC lying about Building 7. There's Building 7. They're saying it's just come down. It's still there. Because she's reading a script about what is supposed to happen on 9/11. Jane Stanley. There are many things to do with the 9/11 attacks. I don't really want to go there too much today, but basically, the American air defences knew for an hour and a half that these planes were flying around, hijacked planes. They didn't even scramble a fighter to intercept these planes. But I think Building 7 is really the key to understanding. This building came down, was brought down at free fall speed by controlled demolition. Who put those charges in that building? No plane hit that building. But it had a lot of evidence in there about trillions of dollars of misspent and disappeared money from the Pentagon. Just another graphic for World Trade Center. There's Building 7 just nearby, but we hardly ever hear about this. And if anyone's interested, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth do a very fantastic job on pulling apart why the 9/11 attacks were actually controlled demolition. There's no way those planes hitting the tops of the buildings brought them down. People got in and put explosives in the buildings to make a nice theatrical show for us. So, okay, so how about the 101st? They were in Eindhoven here. Well, does anyone recognise this guy in the middle? No? It looks a bit like him, I must say. No, this guy's name is Stefan Bandera. He was a Nazi in the Ukraine in the Second World War. He was very loyal Nazi, and he was a hero of the fascists in Ukraine, who nowadays still have pictures of him on their walls and celebrate him. Here we are. And here they are today. This is today, pretty much. This is like now in Ukraine. Or I think these pictures were taken about 2 years ago, where you've got all these young people who love Stefan Bandera. And there you go. Look at them. This is fascism going on in Ukraine. Now this is getting a little bit close to us. This was the Maidan coup in 2014 in February. The centre of the city of Kiev was an inferno. Look at it. This was led by Andrei Perubi, who was the leader of the Maidan coup. And this is the state of the place. Then there was a whole load of assassinations, murders from the Hotel Ukraine, which I think is this building, I'm not quite sure, but if this is the road I think it is, they were actually being sniped at by, and these are police, dead police. So somebody in here, or a few people in here, killed nearly 50 demonstrators and Berkut police who were from the existing regime. The next day, the president, Yanukovych, was chased out of the country, and they had literally a coup the day after this massacre. And there's some more of the poor guys being shot at. But who did the shooting? 101st Airborne Division. This guy here, Brian Christopher Boyinger, is from the 101st Airborne Division. The testimony in the courts in Kiev over the last year has said that he was the guy running around in the Hotel Ukraine giving the orders to the people, snipers, who were paid $6,000 each to shoot those poor people in the street to cause the coup. So there he is, Brian Christopher Boyinger, 101st Airborne Division. And there he is again. And now, this is one of the most recent things I could find about him. It is 26th February 2016. He's joined the Ukrainian Army's Georgian National Legion combat missions in Donbass. So he's fighting the Russians in Donbass. Now let's look, this is Yemen. This is even more horrific. What's happening in that country must be stopped. Let's just say it like that, because you've got the worst outbreak of cholera since medieval times going on in, I don't know how the whole thing's going, but certainly 6 months ago that was what the aid charities were saying. We've got to stop the cholera here because it's killing thousands and thousands of people. Also, the bombing is being done by us, basically. There's some of the graves that they're killing people in wedding ceremonies, in funerals. When I say they, I mean the Saudis. But some people will say that are the Saudis doing the killing or the Saudis fronting the killing? And they're using these wonderful British jets to do it. Well, I think they're British and French, half and half Tornado jets, to do all the killing. And using British munitions. And Britain made, last time I looked, in a year, which I think was the last, I suppose, financial year, £3 billion. From £3 billion of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So the British arms firms are making a load of money out of this slaughter. Now this is slaughter of civilians by people up in aeroplanes, mainly. And it's not just the British ones, it's the Typhoons, Eurofighter and the Strike Eagles. So the world we're living in today is not a democratic world. This is the command structure. The United States has decided it's dominating the planet. And we fall into this thing here called European Command, Stuttgart. AFRICOM is also in Stuttgart because no African country would allow AFRICOM to have a base in their country. But the Americans have decided that this is the command centre for the world. Obviously what's going on in this area at the moment is horrific, with judicial coups in Brazil, etc. And the complete denial of democracy in those places by spying, by US manipulation. There's a picture of the whole world again with this whole system of world with commanders' areas of responsibility. So that's how arrogant the Americans are. Now this is another interesting side, the non-integrating gap countries. There have been various different plans for dominating the world by the Americans, right? This is one which is these countries here have all decided which side they're on. But there's this thing in the middle called the non-integrating gap. These countries haven't decided which side they're on, so we need to destabilise and destroy them until they decide to be on our side. So these are the sort of ready meat, if you want, for the Americans. These non-integrating gap, I think it was 2004, 2005, one of the American generals came up with this and published it in one of their magazines. This is what we're going to do. This is the new Middle East. I don't know if you've ever heard of this country before. Free Kurdistan. This is what the Americans want to do in the Middle East. They want to mix it all up. And actually that will mostly benefit the Israelis, because the Israelis want to see a destabilised Middle East so they can expand. A lot of what the Americans seem to do seems to benefit the Israelis more than it benefits the Americans. So, Saudi Arabia. Our wonderful allies in Saudi Arabia. Well, what's the difference between the two? You tell me. There's no difference. Saudis are, they don't have elections in Saudi Arabia, and our wonderful friends, the Saudis, don't have elections, they've just got a royal family. So, this is what I would suggest. We need to do the same to Israel as we did to South Africa with the Israeli attacks on the Palestinians. Even though, of course, they always say the Palestinians are starting these things. Look, I mean, things like Operation Cast Lead was just the army slaughtering civilians in Gaza, innocent civilians. This is an interesting side to it all. This book, Christian Zionism, was written by Stephen Sizer, who's a former, he's now retired priest from London, vicar. And he's saying, look, this is the plan. This is the fundamentalist nature of Zionism, is taking us down this road, assuming that the Jews are God's chosen people. We must restore Jews to scriptural lands, which is just one interpretation of the Bible. Not everyone would agree with that. Palestine belongs exclusively to the Jews, and that means no one else is allowed there. Restoring Jerusalem, well, we've just seen that with Donald Trump moving the embassy just a few months ago to Jerusalem. The third temple will be built and consecrated. Only one problem with that. That's that the Al-Aqsa Mosque will then have to be demolished, which is one of the most ancient shrines in Islam. That could very easily kick off a war between Islam and the Zionists. So, yeah, interesting book, and it hasn't been reprinted. He keeps trying to get them to reprint it. I think it's into Varsity Press, the publishers, and they won't. So anyway, back to Albert Pike. Albert Pike is suggesting that there is going to be this war in the Middle East, and he thinks it's a great thing, a plan, to have a war in the Middle East, which will then allow his mates, the United States of America, the United States of Europe, to dominate the planet. So here are various scenarios for possible wars between Israel and Iran, which definitely seems to be on the cards. And this is a very interesting book about the Israelis, which is all about Israeli assassinations. So the Israelis, it looks as if, have been assassinating more people than anyone else on the planet since the last 30-46 to 67 war. And he talks here about nearly 3,000 assassinations of top people the Israelis have been up to, Ronan Bergman, which is pretty astounding that the Israelis are still taken seriously by the United Nations when they're going around killing leaders around the world. Their only hope is to keep that information secret and out of the press. So we talk about this book quite a bit on the radio, I can tell you. Another thing is China, because China is pretty much controlled. Triads have been there ever since around about the same time as the Illuminati in Europe. These terror attacks, very questionable about who's caused them. Mark Curtis points out, Britain has been colluding with radical Islam ever since the 1980s in Operation Cyclone to get the Russians out of Afghanistan. We recruited a whole load of crazy jihadis to get the Russians, and we've been working with them ever since, developing more relations. So when I say we, I'm talking about the intelligence services, the CIA, MI6, very closely, funding them, etc. I did a lot of work into the 7/7 bombings. Here is one of the guys that trained two of the alleged bombers on 7/7. Former UK Special Forces soldier was training them, taking these guys out and showing them how to do manoeuvres and this sort of thing. Don't hear a lot about him, and he didn't appear at the inquest or trials and any of the legal stuff to do with the 7/7 bombing. This is much more recent. This poor girl was seduced online and Facebook by it seems Canadian intelligence on Facebook or somebody, and a Canadian intelligence guy met her over in Istanbul. She was taken down through Turkey and brought to ISIS. This is a poor kid, 16 years old, with her friends, 15 2015 taken down to be effectively sex slaves for ISIS, seduced by Canadian intelligence and then taken by British intelligence. They handed them on at the south of Turkey to British intelligence, who brought her over to ISIS. But this sort of stuff is not. I mean, I managed to get an article on redress about this, but you cannot get the mainstream press to pick up on these facts. These are facts. Just, if you need to look any of these names up, just look them up. You'll find it. Westminster Bridge attacker. This is last year. Khalid Massoud, crazy, violent, but he was reported to MI5 hotline saying this guy's really crazy. You've got to keep an eye on him. Oh, anyway, he manages to do a terrorist attack in London. No problem. The same with the other attackers at London Bridge. This guy's appearing on TV. Look, I'm a pro-ISIS fanatic. And then he goes on to do the attack in London Bridge. And the Manchester bomber, even more suspicious, his dad is one of the top agents for MI6. He was involved in the Libyan Islamic fighting group who tried to kill Gaddafi for MI6. He was paid to. And they had to go, but they still got some money. And that's his son, who's the bomber, supposedly. But what's happened to Daddy now? Daddy's disappeared off the face of the earth. There's no proper investigation into these bombs, that's what I'm trying to say. And here's something to do with Manchester, which I put together, which is, characteristics of false flag terror attacks. That's what I'm saying is going on here. The intelligence services are trying to make us afraid of a particular group, in this case, the Muslims, who they are secretly controlled from behind the scenes. So, this is quite clear that helplines didn't work on the Manchester bombing. People are phoning up, want to know what's happened to their loved ones. The numbers are given out to the public, but they're not working. And it was run by Vodafone, I think, but it didn't start working until something like 12, 14 hours after. Vodafone said, well, we're very sorry. Second terrorist giving police and private security total control of the scene. Okay, so what they said at Manchester, and they said the same at the Westminster attack, is there's a second terrorist around, so no one must go anywhere. Now that then disappeared. Journalists were deleting that evidence from Twitter, and it gives the private security and police control of the crime scene, because people can't go and help anyone. Eyewitnesses were not interviewed. A woman called Dawn Waddy, who sat next to someone she thought was the bomber, wasn't even interviewed by the police. Private security. Yeah, she reported this person to the security. She was told twice. Well, how would you like it if someone reported you and said that you were suspicious? Now, what kind of security firm is it that doesn't actually even take a warning someone's giving them? Would be told to keep an eye on everyone. When you go to the police, you go to security, and you say, actually, this person is acting really suspiciously. They're not interested in the concert. They're fiddling with their bag. They seem to be talking to themselves. Oh, well, how would you like it if someone said that about you? And of course, again, no CCTV. Nothing. I mean, there's these few little photos here, no proper CCTV, which places the suspect at the scene. Key thing is, they've shown us pictures of Salman and Bailey, but they're surrounded by black, so you can't see where he is. And we're told, oh, these were taken in the arena. Well, prove it by showing us where the photos were taken. But in a way, this is one of the key things I wanted to talk about today, which means, when I spoke to Hayley first about coming here and doing this talk, she said, look, make sure it's relevant for today, which is a very good, I think, prompt me to make sure we're not just talking about World War II. This is a report from 27th of April last year. German soldier posing as a Syrian refugee is arrested for planning a false flag terror attack. That's in Vienna airport last year. So he was planning some attack inside Vienna airport. He already had gone to the refugee agency and got identity cards as a Syrian refugee, but he wasn't. He was a German soldier. He wasn't a Syrian refugee. The idea being, if there's an attack in this airport, that they say, oh, we found this guy's identity, he's a Syrian refugee, and he did the attack. So we have to be really, really careful about everything we're being told about terror attacks, and forensically pull them apart. Certainly don't believe anything the mainstream press tell you straight away. This, I thought I had to put this in because I was shocked to see this is basically like the devil being erected outside Little Rock, Arkansas's Capitol building just a few weeks ago. They were saying, well, you want to put religious statues around here. We've got our own statue. We've got our own religion. We want Baphomet up in front of the Capitol building here, please, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they had a bit of a pathetic rally in order to do it. But this is the United States today. They seriously think that Satanism is as important a religion and as good a religion as, say, Islam, Judaism or Christianity. And they want it to be on equal terms. Okay, we're getting towards the end now. Sorry, real heroes and villains. Well, here for me is number one, really. He's Moffat Burris. His book is fantastic. He, as a person, when I interviewed him, is absolutely adamant about, I knew that those tanks had to go to Arnhem, and if they didn't go, I was prepared to kill one of those damn British tank drivers, because I'm a paratrooper too, I know what it was like. He says they were hanging on by their fingernails, and maybe we can have that bit of audio. I think he says something along those lines. With Moffat Burris. His voice, for me, it's almost epic.
My name is Moffat Burris. I was a captain in 3rd Battalion, 504 Parachute Regiment, and commanded I Company, which is one of the two assault companies that made the river crossing and captured the bridge at Nijmegen. I remember General Horrocks explaining the critical situation of the British troops in Arnhem, and that if we didn't get there and give them some assistance at the bridge, that in a matter of hours, all would be lost. General Horrocks asked Tucker, can your lads do the job? Can they get the bridge? Colonel Tucker said, let me ask you a question, General. If we take that bridge, what assurance do we have from you that your tanks will be lined up for Arnhem in force? And Horrocks, and I can remember his remarks as if they were yesterday, said, my tanks will be lined up in full force, hell-bent for Arnhem, and nothing will stop them. That's not what happened. One gun stopped them. After we crossed the river and had 50% casualties in that crossing and made it up to the dike, knocked out the machine guns, and went on and captured the north end of the bridge, 4 British tanks came across. The lead tank was knocked out, and the other 3 backed up to the bridge. And I went to the commander of that task force, which was Captain Carrington, and said, why are you stopping? And he said, well, I can't go up there. That gun will knock out the rest of my tanks. I said, we will go with you and get that gun. He said, no, I can't go without orders. And I said, well, I'm giving you orders. An American captain giving a British captain orders went over like a lead balloon. So he said, no, I have to have orders from my British commander.
The road from the bridge was on a sort of embankment, and I think it would have been quite difficult to go ahead. I think it would have been difficult anyway, even in the daylight, because you were a sitting duck if anybody was there. But I thought at night, when we'd just sort of stormed the bridge, so to speak, it would have been very difficult to push through in the dark.
Well, about that time, my frustration was turning to anger. The airborne paratroopers in Arnhem were just hanging on by their fingernails, and that was known by Horrocks and the other troops in Nijmegen, and why they would let that one gun stop them is just beyond belief to me. And as I was talking to Carrington, he was sitting in his tank, and we were having this argument about him not moving out, and when he failed to move, and I ordered him to, and he still failed to move, I cocked my Tommy gun and put it to his head and told him if he didn't get this blankety-blank tank moving, I'd blow his head off. And with that, he ducks down into the tank, closes the hatch, and sits there the rest of the night. Couldn't get to him. As I understand, Carrington denies that anybody pulled a gun on him, but his memory is not quite as good as mine if he really believes that. I bumped into Carrington at the 65th anniversary celebration at a reception that we're having for the Queen. And as he walked up, General Traitors and I were talking, and he introduced me to Carrington, and I said, "Oh, we know each other. We met on the bridge 65 years ago." And Carrington turned and looked at me, and he said, "Oh, you're the chap that called me a yellow-livered coward." And I said, "Is that what I called you?" And he said,
Okay, so that's an exchange, really, a discussion going on between Boris and Carrington, both who were there. Carrington just simply denies it. And there is old Moffat Boris again. What an amazing old fellow. It was just amazing, you know, chatting with him there. I mean, I'm not sure if he's still alive, actually, because I interviewed him about 5 years ago. He was getting on a bit then. But he also managed to trick the Germans into surrendering something like 4,000 or 5,000 men to him. He just came across this massive German army towards the end of the war, and he was in a jeep, and he was surrounded by Germans, and the Germans guys pointing their gun at him and said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I've come to accept your surrender." A bit of audacious thing to say when you're surrounded by Germans. And they said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, my general sent me to accept your surrender, and if you don't surrender to us, you'll have to surrender to the Russians, who are just a few miles over that way." And the Germans went away, had a conversation, and they came back to me and said, "Actually, I'm going to send my colonel, he's going to come with you, and perhaps, if the terms are, we will surrender to you." So he actually got all these Germans to surrender, just by tricking them. He was in a very, very dicey situation, but he tricked them into, because of the fear of the Russians, and of course the Germans knew they'd much rather surrender to these guys than to the Russians. So there's his book, Tony Hibbert, another hero off the bridge at Arnhem. There is him, and I managed to interview him just before he died, about 3 or 4 years ago. He was really adamant that Sosabowski should be exonerated. That's another hero. This is Major Brian Urquhart, who was the intelligence officer. The day before the operation, Browning sacked him. He was saying, "You can't send those 1st Airborne Division into Arnhem because of all the tanks hanging around. They won't be able to survive." So he was sacked for giving the correct advice. That is his life. He went on to become Deputy Secretary General to the UN after the war. And this is another hero. He's the guy that trained the commandos that got Martin Bormann out, but then he died for his trouble. Harold Golden. And this is another hero. He's the guy that went blasting his way through Lent in his tank and got all the way through the German defences. This is Sergeant Robinson from the Grenadier Guards. He was from the first troop of 4 tanks that came across Nijmegen Bridge, a very brave guy. So he got to the stage, I was saying earlier, he got to the stage where, wow, he just got over the bridge, so he was full of it. And he went blasting away and got through all the German defences with his tank, up to the rail bridge at the end of Lent, from which there was no more. Anyway, this is those 2 guys. Remember, we're going from the heroes to the villains now. Here's one of the villains, and here's one of the heroes. Sosabowski, the Polish, to try to do everything he could to help, but was stopped by Browning, by making any kind of excuse, and then by dropping him into the wrong place, really, and also right on top of what he knew were German positions, or very close to German positions, so a lot of the Polish were shot on the way down. Bernhard, super traitor, sending in King Kong, that sort of thing, with his nose in the Allied High Command well before the battle. There he is. And there's as well Browning, looking at a spiffing chap, but absolutely useless, vain. There he is after the war, with his wife, as Daphne du Maurier, the writer. After the war, Browning became an alcoholic, but he dealt with it in a very different way to Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was also an alcoholic after the war, and Fleming was advised, said, "Look, you've got to get it out of your system." In a way, that's what I'm doing here today with you folks. Get it out of your system, write about it, talk about it. And Fleming did. He wrote it in his novels. Whereas there was no way that Browning could deal with, personally, with the absolutely appalling way that he'd led so many to their slaughter here in Market Garden. And he was given a job as in charge of the, first of all, straight away, after the battle, he was sent off to the Far East as far as they could get him, away from anywhere, to work for Mountbatten in the Far East Command, away from Britain. But then he became, after the war, the comptroller for the Duke of Edinburgh's, Prince Philip's money. He was in charge of the money for Prince Philip after the war. There's Morton, another villain, super villain really, as someone who's prepared to take the money from Bormann and conduct this operation in order to steal all the loot from the Second World War to then use for organised crime. So he was really a super villain. I mean, there's something a bit Crowley-esque about this guy. You know, Alistair Crowley, anyone that knows about him. Just, to him, he was one of those people that to him was all just a game and a way to make a load of money in the Second World War. So what can we learn? Last one. What can we learn? Now, here's something we can learn, which is celebrating the life of Harold Golding, who, here is Jill, Harold's granddaughter, down on Hayling Island, and they managed just a couple of years ago to put these plaques up around the island celebrating her grandfather. Jill found in her loft, when her mother died, a whole load of, her grandmother died a few years ago, a big suitcase full of secret stuff that her grandfather shouldn't have had. And so she started to discover and uncover what her grandfather's role had been. Because as I said, he was killed, or died mysteriously, aged 41, just a few weeks after the end of the Second World War. So she's been on a journey of discovery to find out who was this guy that did more raids on the French coast than anyone else and trained all the commandos from World War II. But just as the war was finished, he could start to talk, no more secrets, he keeled over. Who was he? So this is just remembering these people, the real heroes, who the bad guys have gotten rid of. This is another thing, round where I live, we've got loads of airfields with these old memorials sitting there. This is now actually just farmland over here. But there's a little memorial anyway to Market Garden. This is also, the same airfields were often used for the D-Day. Okay, the other thing we can do is write. I think writing's a really good thing to do. And here's someone that did a lot of that, Len Dayton. He was in the military, and here's one of his novels. If you know secrets, you can't write about them, as Jad was struggling with that, the John Ainsworth Davis with OpJB. But what you can do is you can write a novel, and you can weave all sorts of code into that novel, the things you know into that novel. And then none of the government, Ministry of Defence people can put you in handcuffs and send you to jail. Because it's all fiction. So Len's very good. Here is this novel's all about the Nazis taking over London. Another one is Dennis Wheatley. He was a very important planner. He was a novelist. And we're talking about Traitors today. This is one of his series of books on Gregory Sallust, who's his hero, spy. But he's weaving into these novels a lot of what he knew about the real backstory to the Second World War. There's Dennis Wheatley. He died in the 1970s, I think. But he was brought in to be a deception planner in Whitehall, and he knew a lot of the secrets of the Second World War. Now, see, this is a perfect example, isn't it? Look. Wheatley is writing a novel based on what he knew about the various deception tactics that had been used in the Second World War. And he's getting a bit full on with the Satanists, but a lot of this stuff is just people he'd interviewed. Fleming, there he is, tapping away his Bond novels. So, if you find stuff out, write about it. And this is my final slide, because what we really need is to overturn this landlord-dominated world. I think as ordinary people, as ordinary individuals, we need to have what was guaranteed to us in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the end of the Second World War, which was access to water, food and shelter, basic stuff. And unless we have access to those, without having to pay money for them, we're not free. And so, as far as I can see, the environmental movement, the social justice movement, has to focus on those three things. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's Article 25, talks about these things. Everybody needs water, everybody needs food, everybody needs shelter. So we can surely sort out a way of building houses for people. I'm fed up in Britain of seeing homeless people lying around and bankers running the show, buying our politicians. I want to see those people looked after. There's no reason why we can't make sure that everyone has a decent home to live in. And then we'll be, I suppose what we'll be doing is properly getting rid of some of the organised crime that benefited so much from the Second World War because of these traitors, not just in Arnhem, but elsewhere. Right. I personally think something should happen annually here in Oosterbeek, maybe in Arnhem, maybe in Nijmegen, but something should happen annually where there's some kind of counter to the affairs that go on, the slow changing of history, the idea that Arnhem was a great victory of some sort, about liberation. It wasn't about liberation. It was about sabotaging liberation. And it was about the beginning of the Bilderberg meetings 10 years after that as well, which have been organised crime getting well organised after the Second World War. So I'll just finish on that note, that I think we need to challenge these narratives, because otherwise we're in danger of having history sucked away. And as the generation that is now dying, the last people that can remember the battle here, most of them are dead, as you probably know, anyone that lives around here will know, and even people that can remember the Second World War are dead. We need to be challenging the attempts to manipulate history, because I think we will find ourselves in World War again once most of those people are gone and they can't give us advice anymore about what war means and why we should be very wary of our politicians if they start to prepare for war again, which of course they're now doing in places like the Middle East. We keep hearing about Netanyahu just the other week, twice now, he's been threatening nuclear war on Iran. Now we should not be standing for that, and we certainly shouldn't be aligning ourselves with the Israelis in those sorts of circumstances. Otherwise it's all going to happen again. We've got to learn from our history. So thank you for being very patient and listening.